In the heart of a bustling city, where skyscrapers pierced the clouds and streets buzzed with life, there lived a woman named Judge Elena Carter. She was no ordinary woman. She was a trailblazer, a beacon of hope for many in her community. As one of the few black female judges in the city, she had worked tirelessly to earn her place in a profession that often seemed stacked against her. Her courtroom was a sanctuary of fairness and integrity, where people from all walks of life felt heard and respected. But outside those walls, life wasn't always so kind. Elena's journey to becoming a judge hadn't been easy. Growing up in a modest neighborhood, she had faced countless challenges, from teachers who doubted her abilities to classmates who teased her for being different. She had learned early on that the world could be cruel. Yet, instead of letting those obstacles break her, she used them as fuel to push forward. Her parents, hardworking and wise, instilled in her the belief that education was her ticket to a better future. They sacrificed everything to ensure she had access to good schools, and Elena repaid their efforts by excelling academically. By the time she graduated from law school, she had already earned a reputation as someone who didn't back down from a fight. As a judge, Elena was known for her sharp mind and compassionate heart. She listened carefully to every case, weighing the evidence before making decisions that would impact lives forever. Her colleagues admired her dedication, and the community trusted her to deliver justice without bias. But despite her success, Elena knew that being a black woman in a position of authority came with its own set of challenges. People often questioned her competence, assuming she had gotten where she was because of affirmative action rather than merit. These comments stung, but Elena refused to let them define her. Instead, she focused on doing her job with excellence, hoping to prove her critics wrong. One Friday evening, after a long and exhausting week in court, Elena decided to take a drive to clear her mind. The stress of presiding over emotionally charged cases had left her drained, and she needed some time alone to recharge. The sun had dipped below the horizon, casting a warm orange glow across the sky. She rolled down the window of her car, letting the cool night breeze wash away some of the tension that lingered from the day. The roads were quiet, and for a moment, she felt at peace. But that peace was short-lived. As Elena approached a quiet intersection, she noticed flashing blue lights in her rearview mirror. Confused, she slowed down and pulled over to the side of the road. Her heart raced as she tried to think of what she might have done wrong. Had she accidentally run a red light? Was her license plate expired? She couldn't recall breaking any traffic laws, but she knew it was best to remain calm and cooperative. When the officer walked up to her car, Elena's confusion turned to unease. It was Officer Mark Reynolds, a man whose name she had heard whispered in hushed tones around the courthouse. He had a reputation for being aggressive and prejudiced, often targeting people of color during routine stops. His demeanor now confirmed those rumors. Without even asking for her license or registration, he began shouting accusations at her, claiming she had been driving recklessly, a claim that was completely baseless. Elena took a deep breath, trying to stay composed. "Officer, may I ask what I did wrong?" she asked politely, her voice steady despite the knot forming in her stomach. But instead of answering her question, Officer Reynolds sneered, his lips curling into a smirk. "You people never learn." He spat, his tone dripping with disdain. The words hit Elena like a punch to the gut. She had heard similar remarks before, but hearing them now in this context felt especially demeaning. When Officer Reynolds finally demanded her identification, Elena handed it over, watching as his expression shifted from smugness to surprise, and then to anger. Seeing her title, Honorable Judge Elena Carter, should have prompted respect, but instead it seemed to enrage him further. "Oh, so you're a judge now?" he said mockingly, emphasizing the word judge, as if it were an insult. "Big shot, huh? Think you're better than everyone else?" Elena's patience was wearing thin, but she reminded herself to stay calm. "I'm just asking what I did wrong, officer," she said firmly, her voice still measured. "If there's an issue, I'd like to understand it." But Officer Reynolds wasn't interested in explanations. In a move that shocked even Elena, he ordered her out of the car and placed her in handcuffs, all while she protested, insisting she hadn't broken any laws. Passers-by stared in disbelief as they witnessed the humiliating scene unfold. A respected judge being treated like a criminal, simply because of the color of her skin. The weight of the moment settled heavily on Elena's shoulders. How could this be happening? She had spent years fighting for justice only to find herself on the receiving end of such blatant discrimination. As she stood there, handcuffed and humiliated, she couldn't help but wonder how many others had endured similar treatment, and how many had suffered in silence because they didn't have the platform she did. By the time Elena was released, hours later, news of the incident had already begun to spread. Security cameras near the intersection had captured the entire ordeal, and footage quickly made its way to social media. The video showed Officer Reynolds' hostility and disregard for protocol, leaving little room for doubt about his misconduct. Public outrage erupted almost instantly. Protesters gathered outside the police station, holding signs that read, "Justice for Judge Carter" and "End Police Brutality." Hashtags supporting Elena trended nationwide, sparking conversations about systemic racism and abuse of power within law enforcement. For Elena, the days following the arrest were a blur of emotions. While relieved to have been vindicated, she couldn't shake the memory of standing on the side of the road, humiliated and powerless. Friends and colleagues urged her to file a formal complaint against Officer Reynolds, but she hesitated. Filing a complaint meant putting herself directly in the line of fire, risking retaliation not just from Reynolds, but potentially from others who shared his views. Still, something inside her refused to let the matter rest. If nothing else, she owed it to herself, and to the countless others who might face similar injustices, to speak up. Meanwhile, Officer Reynolds remained unapologetic. Backed by his union and emboldened by years of operating above reproach, he dismissed the backlash as mere noise. In interviews, he doubled down on his actions, insisting he had followed protocol despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. His arrogance only fueled public anger further, leading to increased scrutiny of his past behavior. Reports surfaced alleging multiple instances of misconduct, including racially motivated arrests and excessive use of force. Each revelation chipped away at his credibility, yet he remained defiant, convinced he was untouchable. Behind closed doors, however, cracks began to show. Fellow officers distanced themselves from him, fearing association with someone now considered toxic. His superiors grew uneasy, knowing they couldn't shield him forever, and then came the tipping point. An internal investigation unearthed damning evidence linking him to falsified reports and planted evidence in previous cases. Suddenly, the tables turned. The same system he had exploited for years became his undoing. For Judge Carter, the moment of reckoning arrived sooner than expected. During a routine court session, Officer Reynolds appeared in her courtroom, not as a witness or defendant, but as part of a mandatory ethics training program required for all officers under investigation. The irony was palpable. As he stood, there shifting uncomfortably under her gaze, she felt a mix of emotions: anger, vindication, and a deep sense of responsibility. This was her chance to confront him, not with rage, but with the same impartiality she brought to every case. When it was her turn to address the group, she spoke candidly about the importance of trust between law enforcement and the communities they served. She recounted her own experience not to shame him publicly, but to illustrate how easily power could corrupt when unchecked. Her words resonated deeply with many in the room, including some of Reynolds's colleagues, who began whispering among themselves. For Officer Reynolds, though, the lecture hit too close to home. Unable to meet her eyes, he stormed out midway through, drawing more attention to himself than ever before. Word of his outburst spread quickly, adding fuel to the fire, already consuming his career. Within days, disciplinary hearings were scheduled, and pressure mounted for his dismissal. Even his staunchest supporters began distancing themselves, realizing the tide had turned irreversibly against him. Karma, it seemed, had finally caught up. Though scars remained, both personal and societal, the incident served as a catalyst for progress. People began to see that true justice wasn't about revenge. It was about accountability and transformation. For Judge Carter, the experience reinforced her belief in the power of resilience and the enduring strength of hope. And for Officer Reynolds, it was a harsh reminder that no one is above the law, not even those sworn to uphold it. Years later, when reflecting on that fateful night, Judge Carter often thought about how far they'd all come since then. The road ahead was still long, but each step forward brought them closer to a world where fairness wasn't just an ideal, it was a reality. The arrest of Judge Elena Carter became a lightning rod for national outrage almost overnight. The video footage, which captured every humiliating moment of the encounter with Officer Mark Reynolds, spread like wildfire across social media platforms. People were horrified by what they saw. A respected judge handcuffed on the side of the road, treated as if she were a common criminal simply because of the color of her skin. The injustice was undeniable, and it struck a chord with millions. News outlets picked up the story within hours, running headlines that highlighted not only the blatant abuse of power, but also the racial bias displayed by Officer Reynolds. Black female judge arrested during traffic stop. Allegations of racial profiling emerge, read one headline, while another proclaimed, "Systemic racism exposed. Cop humiliates prominent judge." Journalists scrambled to gather more information, interviewing witnesses, legal experts, and community leaders who condemned the incident in no uncertain terms. Protesters took to the streets almost immediately, gathering outside the police station where Officer Reynolds worked. They held signs that read, "Justice for Judge Carter, no more police brutality, and Black Lives Matter." Chants echoed through the city, demanding accountability and reform. Social media played a pivotal role in amplifying the movement. Hashtags such as "Justice for Elena Carter" and "Accountability" now trended globally, drawing attention from activists, celebrities, and even politicians. Influencers used their platforms to share the video and call for action, urging their followers to sign petitions demanding an investigation into Officer Reynolds' conduct. Within days, thousands of signatures poured in, putting immense pressure on local authorities to address the growing public outcry. Some supporters went further, organizing fundraisers to support Judge Carter's legal fees should she decide to pursue charges against the officer. The solidarity was overwhelming, and it gave Elena a sense of hope amidst the chaos. Meanwhile, Judge Carter herself struggled to process everything that had happened. Though she had been released without charges shortly after the arrest, the emotional toll lingered. Friends and colleagues rallied around her, offering words of encouragement and pledging their support. Her close friend and fellow judge, Maria Thompson, visited her at home the day after the incident. Sitting in Elena's living room surrounded by stacks of legal books and framed photos of her family, Maria listened intently as Elena recounted the harrowing experience. "I've spent my entire career fighting for fairness," Elena said, her voice trembling with emotion. "I've seen firsthand how the system fails people, how it discriminates, how it dehumanizes. But I never thought I'd be on the receiving end of it. It's humbling in the worst way possible." Maria reached out and placed a comforting hand on Elena's shoulder. "You're stronger than this, Elena. You've always stood up for what's right even when it wasn't easy. This is your chance to fight back, not just for yourself but for everyone who can't." Elena nodded slowly, considering Maria's words. She knew her friend was right. If she stayed silent, it would send a message that such behavior was acceptable, that officers like Reynolds could act with impunity. Yet, the thought of filing a formal complaint filled her with dread. Would doing so put her career at risk? Could she trust the very system she had devoted her life to serving? These questions weighed heavily on her mind. While Elena grappled with her decision, Officer Reynolds remained defiant. Backed by his union and emboldened by years of operating, above reproach, he dismissed the backlash as mere noise. In interviews with reporters, he doubled down on his actions, insisting he had followed protocol despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. She was being uncooperative, he claimed, his tone dripping with arrogance. "If you don't follow instructions during a traffic stop, there are consequences." plain and simple. But the public wasn't buying it. As more details about the incident emerged, so did reports of Reynolds's troubling past. Investigations revealed multiple complaints filed against him over the years, many alleging racial profiling and excessive use of force. One case involved a young black man who claimed Reynolds had planted drugs in his car during a routine stop. Another described how Reynolds had violently subdued a teenage girl for questioning his authority. Though none of these allegations had led to disciplinary action, they painted a damning picture of a man who believed himself untouchable. The mounting scrutiny began to take its toll. Fellow officers, once quick to defend him, started distancing themselves. Some expressed discomfort working alongside him, fearing guilt by association. Others privately admitted they had long suspected Reynolds of misconduct but had been too afraid to speak up. Even his superiors grew uneasy, realizing that shielding him any longer could damage the department's already fragile relationship with the community. Amidst the growing tension, Elena made her decision. With Maria's encouragement and the unwavering support of her loved ones, she filed a formal complaint against Officer Reynolds. The move sent shockwaves through the city. Legal experts hailed it as a bold step toward accountability, while critics accused her of seeking revenge. For Elena, though, it wasn't about vengeance. It was about justice. She wanted to ensure that no one else would have to endure what she had gone through. The complaint triggered an internal investigation, spearheaded by an independent oversight committee tasked with reviewing cases of alleged misconduct within the police force. Investigators combed through Reynolds' records, interviewing witnesses and examining evidence. What they uncovered was staggering. Not only did they find inconsistencies in his reports, but they also discovered instances where he had falsified documents to justify arrests. One particularly egregious case involved a homeless man who had been wrongfully imprisoned for months based on fabricated testimony provided by Reynolds. As the investigation unfolded, public pressure intensified. Protesters continued to march, daily, their numbers swelling with each passing week. Community organizations partnered with civil rights groups to host town hall meetings, calling for sweeping reforms within law enforcement. Politicians, eager to align themselves with the growing movement, introduced legislation aimed at increasing transparency and accountability in policing. The momentum was unstoppable. Officer Reynolds, however, refused to acknowledge the gravity of the situation. Convinced that his connections and reputation would shield him, he maintained his arrogant demeanor. He attended press conferences flanked by union representatives, dismissing the allegations as baseless attacks designed to tarnish his image. His confidence bordered on delusion, leaving many to wonder how someone so deeply entrenched in controversy could remain so oblivious to the shifting tide. Behind closed doors, however, cracks began to show. Fellow officers whispered about his erratic behavior, noting how he had become increasingly paranoid and defensive. His wife, Sarah, noticed changes too. Once proud and self-assured, Reynolds now snapped at the slightest provocation, pacing the house late at night as if expecting disaster to strike at any moment. When she confronted him about his mental state, he brushed her off, insisting he was fine, but deep down he knew the walls were closing in. One evening, as Reynolds sat alone in his dimly lit kitchen, nursing a glass of whiskey, his phone buzzed incessantly with notifications. News alerts flooded in, detailing yet another damning revelation from the investigation. A former colleague had come forward, corroborating claims that Reynolds had tampered with evidence in a high-profile case years earlier. The whistleblower's testimony was detailed and damning, leaving little room for doubt. For the first time, Reynolds felt a flicker of fear, a realization that his carefully constructed facade was crumbling. The next morning, he arrived at work visibly shaken. Colleagues avoided eye contact, pretending not to notice the dark circles under his eyes or the tremor in his hands. Rumors swirled about impending disciplinary hearings, with some speculating that termination was inevitable. Reynolds tried to maintain his usual bravado, barking orders and making idle threats. But his authority had evaporated. No one feared him anymore. By the time the Oversight Committee announced its findings, the writing was on the wall. Reynolds was stripped of his badge and barred from working in law enforcement ever again. The decision marked a turning point, not just for him, but for the entire department. Sweeping reforms were implemented, including mandatory anti-bias training, increased oversight, and stricter penalties for misconduct. For many, it was a small but significant step toward rebuilding trust between law enforcement and the communities they served. Judge Carter watched the developments unfold with a mix of emotions. While vindicated, she couldn't help but feel sorrow for the countless others who hadn't received the same level of support. Her experience had opened her eyes to the systemic issues plaguing the justice system, and she vowed to use her platform to advocate for change. She spoke at rallies, wrote op-eds, and collaborated with activists to push for legislative action. Her message was clear. True justice required more than holding individuals accountable. It demanded dismantling the structures that allowed such injustices to occur in the first place. As weeks turned into months, the city began to heal. The terror, protests gradually subsided, replaced by constructive dialogue and collaborative efforts to. The internal investigation into Officer Mark Reynolds' conduct was a turning point not just for him, but for the entire police department. What began as a routine inquiry quickly spiraled into a full-blown exposé of systemic corruption and abuse of power. The Oversight Committee tasked with reviewing the case left no stone unturned, meticulously examining every aspect of Reynolds' career. They interviewed dozens of witnesses, including former colleagues, victims of his misconduct, and even some who had initially been too afraid to speak out. Each testimonial added another layer to the damning portrait emerging of a man who had operated above the law for far too long. One of the most shocking revelations came from a retired detective named James Harper. Harper had worked alongside Reynolds for nearly a decade before leaving the force due to health issues. During his interview with investigators, he recounted an incident that had haunted him for years. There was this kid, couldn't have been more than 19, Harper explained, his voice heavy with regret. Reynolds pulled him over for no reason, accused him of dealing drugs. When the kid protested, Reynolds got violent. He slammed him against the car, searched him, and when he found nothing, he planted evidence. I saw it happen. But back then, you didn't question guys like Reynolds. If you did, you were next. Harper's testimony sent shockwaves through the department. It wasn't just the act itself that horrified people. It was the complicity of others who had turned a blind eye. For years, officers like Harper had stayed silent, fearing retaliation or ostracism. But now, emboldened by the growing movement, sparked by Judge Carter's arrest, they finally felt safe enough to come forward. Their stories painted a chilling picture of a culture where racism and brutality were not only tolerated but often rewarded. As more whistleblowers stepped up, the investigation expanded beyond Reynolds to include broader patterns of misconduct within the department. Files were unearthed showing how certain officers consistently targeted minority neighborhoods, conducting unnecessary stops and searches under the guise of routine patrols. Complaints filed by citizens were routinely dismissed or buried, ensuring that those responsible faced no consequences. Even higher-ups were implicated, accused of covering up incidents to protect their own reputations. The deeper investigators dug, the clearer it became that Reynolds was not an isolated bad apple. He was part of a rotten tree. For Judge Carter, these revelations were both validating and heartbreaking. On one hand, she felt vindicated knowing that her experience was not unique, that countless others had suffered similar injustices at the hands of individuals like Reynolds. On the other hand, the sheer scale of the problem overwhelmed her. How could such widespread corruption have gone unchecked for so long? And what would it take to truly root it out? Despite the mounting evidence against him, Reynolds remained defiant. He continued to insist he had done nothing wrong, dismissing the allegations as politically motivated attacks designed to undermine law enforcement. In public appearances, he portrayed himself as a victim of cancel culture, claiming that the backlash against him was proof that society had lost its way. His rhetoric resonated with some, particularly those who distrusted movements advocating for police reform, but it alienated many more. Supporters of Judge Carter saw through his attempts to deflect blame, recognizing them for what they were, desperate efforts to avoid accountability. Behind closed doors, however, Reynolds' bravado began to crack. The stress of the investigation weighed heavily on him, manifesting in sleepless nights and erratic behavior. His once imposing presence grew haggard. Dark circles formed under his eyes, and his usual swagger gave way to fidgety unease. Colleagues noted how he jumped at every knock on his office door, convinced it was investigators coming to deliver the final blow. At home, tensions mounted between him and his wife, Sarah. Once supportive of his career, she now questioned whether standing by him was worth the toll it was taking on their family. "You're lying to yourself if you think this will blow over," Sarah told him one evening, her voice tinged with frustration. "They've got you cornered, Mark. Everyone knows it. Why can't you admit you made mistakes?" Reynolds snapped back, his temper flaring. "Mistakes? Are you kidding me? These people are out for blood. They don't care about justice. They care about revenge." Sarah sighed, shaking her head. "No, Mark. Justice is holding people accountable for their actions. That's all anyone's asking for, but instead of owning up, you keep doubling down. Do you really think that's going to help?" Her words struck a nerve, but Reynolds refused to listen. Deep down, he knew she was right, but admitting it meant confronting the reality he had spent years denying. He couldn't bring himself to do it. Meanwhile, the public outcry reached new heights. Protesters continued to march daily, their numbers swelling with each passing week. Community organizations partnered with civil rights groups to host town hall meetings, calling for sweeping reforms within law enforcement. Politicians, eager to align themselves with the growing movement, introduced legislation aimed at increasing transparency and accountability in policing. The momentum was unstoppable. In response to the pressure, city officials announced plans to implement significant changes within the police department. Among the proposed measures were mandatory anti-bias training for all officers, the establishment of an independent review board to oversee complaints of misconduct, and stricter penalties for violations of protocol. While some hailed these steps as long overdue, others argued they didn't go far enough. Activists called for defunding the police altogether, redirecting resources toward community-based programs focused on prevention rather than punishment. Judge Carter watched these developments unfold with cautious optimism. She understood that meaningful change wouldn't happen overnight. It would require sustained effort and vigilance. Still, she couldn't help but feel hopeful seeing so many people united in pursuit of a common goal. For years, she had fought for justice in courtrooms, ruling on individual cases and striving to make fair decisions. Now she realized her role extended beyond the bench. She had a responsibility to use her platform to advocate for systemic change, to ensure that stories like hers didn't become cautionary tales but catalysts for progress. With this newfound purpose, Elena threw herself into activism. She attended rallies, delivering powerful speeches that inspired crowds to keep pushing for reform. She wrote op-eds detailing her experiences and urging lawmakers to prioritize equity and accountability. She collaborated with grassroots organizations, lending her voice to campaigns aimed at educating the public about racial injustice and empowering marginalized communities to demand better. Her message was clear. True justice required more than holding individuals accountable. It demanded dismantling the structures that allowed such injustices to occur in the first place. Her advocacy earned her widespread admiration and criticism. Some praised her courage, hailing her as a hero for speaking out despite the risks. Others accused her of playing politics, arguing that judges should remain impartial and detached from social movements. To Elena, though, the distinction seemed artificial. "How can I claim to uphold justice if I ignore the systems that perpetuate inequality?" she asked during one speech. "Silence isn't neutrality, it's complicity, and I refuse to be complicit." As weeks turned into months, the tide began to turn decisively against Reynolds. The Oversight Committee released its findings in a scathing report that left little room for interpretation. According to the document, Reynolds had engaged in numerous instances of misconduct throughout his career, including falsifying reports, planting evidence, and using excessive force. The report concluded that his actions constituted a pattern of behavior incompatible with the ethical standards expected of law enforcement officers, and recommended immediate termination. The recommendation was swiftly acted upon. Within days, Reynolds was stripped of his badge and formally barred from working in law enforcement ever again. The decision marked a symbolic victory for those fighting for accountability, but it also served as a stark reminder of the work still needed to address deeper systemic issues. For many, it was a bittersweet moment. While justice had been served in this particular case, the battle against institutionalized racism and abuse of power was far from over. For Reynolds, the loss of his badge was devastating. Stripped of the identity he had clung to for decades, he struggled to find meaning in a world that no longer welcomed him. His marriage crumbled under the weight of his bitterness, and he withdrew from friends and family, consumed by anger and self-pity. Karma, it seemed, had caught up with him, not in the form of vengeance but in the cold, hard truth of consequence. As for Judge Carter, the ordeal transformed her in ways she never anticipated. She emerged stronger, more determined than ever, to fight for a world where fairness wasn't just an ideal, it was a reality. Years later, when reflecting on that fateful night, she often thought about how far they'd all come since then. The road ahead was still long, but each step forward brought them closer to a brighter future. And for Officer Reynolds, whose downfall served as a cautionary tale, it was a harsh reminder that no one is above the law, not even those sworn to uphold it. The fallout from Officer Mark Reynolds' termination sent ripples through the city, forcing people to confront uncomfortable truths about the justice system they had long taken for granted. For many, his downfall was a wake-up call, a stark reminder that trust in law enforcement couldn't be rebuilt without addressing the deep-rooted issues that allowed misconduct to flourish unchecked. But for others, it was a bitter pill to swallow, sparking debates about accountability, fairness, and whether true reform was even possible. In the weeks following Reynolds' dismissal, the police department underwent sweeping changes. New leadership was brought in, tasked with implementing the reforms proposed by city officials. Among the first steps was the creation of an independent oversight board made up of community members, legal experts, and retired officers. This board would review complaints against police officers, investigate allegations of misconduct, and recommend disciplinary actions when necessary. It was a bold move aimed at restoring public confidence, though skeptics questioned whether it would actually make a difference. Training programs were also revamped. Mandatory anti-bias workshops became a cornerstone of officer development, focusing not just on recognizing prejudice, but understanding its impact on policing decisions. Role-playing scenarios replaced outdated lectures, encouraging officers to think critically about how their actions affected different communities. Some embraced the training enthusiastically, seeing it as an opportunity to grow and improve. Others, however, resisted, grumbling that it was a waste of time or accusing organizers of vilifying law enforcement. Tensions simmered beneath the surface, threatening to boil over at any moment. For Judge Carter, these developments were both encouraging and frustrating. On one hand, she saw genuine efforts being made to address systemic problems, efforts that might prevent someone else from enduring what she had gone through. On the other hand, progress felt agonizingly slow. Every policy change seemed to come with caveats, every step forward accompanied by 2 steps back. She knew real transformation wouldn't happen overnight, but patience wasn't her strong suit, not when lives were at stake. Her frustration reached a tipping point during a routine court session several months after the incident. As judges often did, Elena presided over cases involving arrests conducted by local police officers. One particular case caught her attention. A young black man named Marcus Johnson stood accused of resisting arrest after being stopped for allegedly speeding. The arresting officer, who happened to be one of Reynolds' former colleagues, claimed Marcus had been uncooperative and aggressive. However, body cam footage told a very different story. The video showed the officer pulling Marcus over without clear cause, then escalating the situation unnecessarily. When Marcus asked why he had been stopped, the officer responded with hostility, demanding identification and refusing to explain himself. Within minutes, the encounter turned physical, with the officer slamming Marcus onto the hood of his car and handcuffing him despite no signs of resistance. Watching the footage, Elena couldn't help but draw parallels between this incident and her own experience with Reynolds. It was as if nothing had changed. When the prosecutor presented the case arguing that Marcus's behavior justified the use of force, Elena interrupted. "Your Honor," the prosecutor began, clearly startled by her interjection. "The defendant failed to comply with lawful orders which necessitated—" "That is not what the evidence shows," Elena said sharply, cutting him off. Her tone was calm but firm, commanding the room's attention. According to the body cam footage, the officer escalated the situation without provocation. Furthermore, there appears to be no valid reason for the stop in the first place. Are we seriously suggesting that questioning authority constitutes grounds for arrest? The courtroom fell silent. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably, searching for words that wouldn't come. Finally, he muttered something about deferring to her judgment and sat down. Elena wasted no time issuing her ruling. All charges against Marcus were dismissed, and she ordered the arresting officer to undergo additional sensitivity training. More importantly, she instructed the district attorney's office to investigate the circumstances surrounding the arrest, emphasizing that repeated patterns of misconduct could not be ignored. News of the ruling spread quickly, reigniting discussions about accountability within law enforcement. Many praised Elena for standing up to injustice, while critics accused her of overstepping her bounds. But for Elena, this wasn't about personal vindication. It was about setting a precedent. If judges allowed questionable arrests to go unchallenged, they risked perpetuating the same cycle of abuse they claimed to oppose. By speaking out, she hoped to send a message. Silence wasn't neutrality. It was complicity. As the investigation into the arresting officer unfolded, another bombshell dropped. Investigators discovered that the officer had been involved in multiple controversial stops, all targeting minority drivers. In each instance, the justification for the stop had been flimsy at best and the outcomes disproportionately punitive. Worse still, internal reviews of these incidents had either been cursory or non-existent, allowing the officer to continue operating unchecked. The findings painted a damning picture of a culture where accountability remained elusive. Even after high-profile cases like Reynolds, public outrage surged once again. Protesters returned to the streets, their chants louder and angrier than before. Signs reading, "Justice delayed is justice denied," and "Fire corrupt cops now," filled the air, echoing the frustration of a community tired of empty promises. Community leaders called for immediate action, urging officials to terminate officers found guilty of repeated misconduct. Politicians scrambled to respond, introducing new bills aimed at increasing transparency and imposing stricter penalties for violations of protocol. Amidst the chaos, Judge Carter found herself thrust further into the spotlight. Reporters hounded her for comments, activists sought her endorsement, and politicians invited her to testify before legislative committees. While some welcomed her advocacy, others viewed her growing influence with suspicion, accusing her of abandoning judicial impartiality in favor of activism. To them, her willingness to speak out undermined the integrity of the judiciary. Elena brushed off the criticism, knowing full well that staying silent would only perpetuate the status quo. "I didn't ask for this role," she told a close friend during a rare quiet moment. "But if I have the power to make a difference, how can I justify doing nothing? Justice isn't passive, it's active. And right now our system needs active voices." Her determination inspired others to join the fight. Young lawyers looked to her as a mentor, eager to learn how to navigate the complexities of advocating for change while maintaining professionalism. Activists credited her with helping bridge the gap between grassroots movements and institutional reform, bringing legitimacy to their cause. Even some within the police department began to see her as a catalyst for meaningful dialogue, acknowledging that change couldn't happen without confronting uncomfortable truths. Meanwhile, Officer Reynolds struggled to adjust to life outside the force. Stripped of his badge and ostracized by former colleagues, he found himself adrift in a world that no longer respected or feared him. His attempts to find employment were met with rejection after rejection, as employers balked at his tarnished reputation. Financial strain added to his woes, forcing him and Sarah to sell their home and move into a cramped apartment. Their relationship deteriorated further, with arguments becoming increasingly frequent and heated. "You brought this on yourself," Sarah snapped during one particularly volatile exchange. "You had chances to fix things, to apologize, to admit you were wrong, but instead you dug your heels in and acted like you were untouchable." "Well, guess what? You're not untouchable anymore." Reynolds glared at her, his jaw clenched tight. "Don't act like you're innocent here," he shot back. "You stood by me for years while I did whatever it took to keep this city safe. Now you're throwing me under the bus because it's convenient?" "It's not about convenience," Sarah shouted, tears streaming down her face. "It's about owning up to your mistakes. But you refuse to do that because admitting fault means losing control, and that's something you'll never accept." The argument ended in silence, with neither willing to concede. Over time, Sarah distanced herself emotionally, eventually filing for divorce. Alone and embittered, Reynolds retreated further into isolation, consumed by resentment and regret. Karma, it seemed, had delivered its final blow, not through vengeance, but through the weight of consequence. For Judge Carter, the contrast between her journey and Reynolds' descent served as a powerful reminder of the choices people make and the paths those choices lead to. Hers had been paved with resilience, courage, and an unwavering commitment to justice. His had spiraled into ruin, driven by arrogance and denial. Yet she refused to gloat or revel in his downfall. Instead, she focused on the bigger picture, the work still needed to ensure that stories like hers didn't become cautionary tales but stepping stones toward a better future. Years later, when reflecting on that tumultuous period, Elena often thought about how far they'd all come since then. The road ahead remained uncertain, fraught with challenges and setbacks. But each victory, as the months rolled by, Judge Elena Carter became a symbol of resilience and hope for many who had grown disillusioned with the justice system. Her unwavering commitment to fairness and accountability resonated deeply with people from all walks of life. From community activists to young law students, she inspired countless individuals to believe that change was possible, even in a system riddled with flaws. Yet despite her growing influence, Elena remained grounded, refusing to let the weight of public scrutiny or criticism sway her from her mission. One of the most significant milestones in her journey came when she was invited to speak at a national conference on criminal justice reform. The event brought together lawmakers, legal experts, civil rights advocates, and members of marginalized communities to discuss strategies for dismantling systemic racism within policing and the courts. For Elena, it was both an honor and a responsibility. She knew her words carried weight, and she wanted to use them wisely. Standing before a packed auditorium, Elena began her speech with a story, her own. "I never imagined I'd be standing here today sharing my experience as a victim of police misconduct," she said, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. "But here I am, because silence isn't neutrality. It's complicity. And if we want to create a fairer, more just society, we must all choose to speak up." Her audience listened intently as she recounted the night of her arrest, describing not only the humiliation she endured, but also the broader implications of what had happened. "What Officer Reynolds did to me wasn't just about one bad cop making poor decisions," she explained. "It was a symptom of a much larger problem, a culture that allows prejudice and abuse of power to thrive unchecked. Until we address that culture, no amount of policy changes will truly fix the system." Elena went on to outline concrete steps she believed were necessary for meaningful reform. These included increasing transparency through mandatory body cam usage, implementing stricter oversight mechanisms, and investing in community-based programs aimed at preventing crime rather than punishing it after the fact. But perhaps her most powerful message was about empathy, the need for officers to see the humanity in the people they served, and for citizens to hold law enforcement accountable without resorting to hostility. "When we dehumanize each other, we lose sight of our shared values," she said, her tone softening. We forget that justice isn't about retribution. It's about restoration. It's about healing wounds, not creating new ones. And that starts with listening to each other, to our fears, to our hopes. The applause that followed was thunderous, echoing through the hall long after she stepped away from the podium. Attendees lined up to thank her, some tearfully recounting their own experiences with injustice. Others asked for advice on how to advocate for change in their own communities. Elena took the time to speak with each person, offering encouragement and practical guidance. By the end of the day, she felt a renewed sense of purpose, a reminder that her fight extended far beyond her courtroom. Back home, however, the battle continued. While progress had been made, resistance to reform remained strong. Some officers resented the increased scrutiny, viewing it as an attack on their profession. Others simply paid lip service to the new policies, going through the motions without truly embracing the spirit behind them. Community trust, though improving, was still fragile, with many residents skeptical that real change would ever take root. To address these challenges, Elena partnered with local organizations to launch a series of town hall meetings designed to foster dialogue between law enforcement and the communities they served. These gatherings weren't easy. Tensions often ran high, and disagreements erupted into heated debates. But Elena saw value in the discomfort, believing that honest conversations, even difficult ones, were essential for building understanding. At one such meeting, a young woman named Lisa Martinez stood up to share her story. She described how her brother had been wrongfully arrested years earlier, spending months in jail before charges were dropped due to lack of evidence. They ruined his life, Lisa said, her voice trembling with anger. He lost his job, his apartment, everything, and no one ever apologized. No one held anyone accountable. A hush fell over the room as Lisa's words sank in. Sitting nearby, an officer named Robert Harris shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Finally, he raised his hand and spoke. "I can't undo what happened to your brother," he admitted, his tone sincere. "But I can promise you this. I'm here because I don't want to be part of the problem anymore. I want to do better for your family, for mine, for everyone." Lisa stared at him for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then slowly she nodded. "That's a start," she said quietly. "But actions matter more than words." Moments like these gave Elena hope. They reminded her that while systemic issues couldn't be solved overnight, small victories could pave the way for lasting change. Each handshake exchanged between a resident and an officer, each apology offered, each commitment to improvement, all of it mattered. Meanwhile, Officer Mark Reynolds' life spiraled further into despair. Divorced, unemployed, and ostracized by nearly everyone he had once called friend or ally, he struggled to find meaning in a world that seemed determined to punish him. His bitterness hardened into resentment, manifesting in increasingly erratic behavior. He spent hours scrolling through online forums filled with conspiracy theories and anti-reform rhetoric, seeking validation for his worldview. Over time, he became convinced that he was the victim of a vast political agenda, an innocent man scapegoated by a society bent on destroying law enforcement. One evening, unable to shake the feeling that the world was against him, Reynolds decided to attend a rally organized by a group calling itself the Blue Line Defenders. Comprised largely of disgruntled former officers and their supporters, the organization claimed to defend the honor of law enforcement while railing against what they described as anti-police propaganda. For Reynolds, it felt like finding refuge in a storm, a place where he could vent his frustrations without judgment. The rally was held in a dimly lit warehouse on the outskirts of the city. Dozens of attendees gathered, some carrying signs reading "Back the Blue" and "Stop Police Bashing." A charismatic speaker took the stage, delivering a fiery monologue that painted officers like Reynolds as martyrs betrayed by a corrupt system. "They think they can break us, but they're wrong," he shouted, eliciting cheers from the crowd. "We are the guardians of this nation, and we will not back down." Reynolds clapped along with the others, feeling a surge of vindication. For the first time in months, he didn't feel alone. But as the night wore on, something gnawed at the edges of his conscience. a nagging doubt he couldn't quite suppress. Was he really a martyr, or was he clinging to denial because admitting fault meant confronting the truth? Later that week, Reynolds received a call from an old acquaintance who worked as a private investigator. The man offered him a job conducting background checks for corporate clients, promising steady pay and minimal oversight. Desperate for income, Reynolds accepted, though the work left him feeling hollow. It wasn't the career he had envisioned for himself, nor did it bring him any closer to reclaiming the respect he craved. Instead, it served as a constant reminder of everything he had lost. For Judge Carter, the contrast between her journey and Reynolds's descent was stark. Where she had found strength in adversity, he had succumbed to bitterness and self-pity. Yet she refused to view his downfall as a personal victory. To her, it was a tragedy, a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked arrogance and the importance of accountability. She hoped his story would serve as a lesson not just for law enforcement, but for society as a whole. Years later, when reflecting on that tumultuous period, Elena often thought about how far they'd all come since then. The road ahead remained, uncertain, fraught with challenges and setbacks. But each victory, no matter how small, brought them closer to a world where fairness wasn't just an ideal, it was a reality. And for Officer Reynolds, whose fall from grace served as a cautionary tale, it was a harsh reminder that no one is above the law, not even those sworn to uphold it. Years after the arrest that had changed her life forever, Judge Elena Carter found herself reflecting on how far she and society had come. The scars of that night still lingered, but they no longer defined her. Instead, they served as reminders of resilience, courage, and the power of collective action. Her journey from victim to advocate had not been easy, but it had been worth every struggle. She had seen firsthand how individual stories could spark movements, how personal pain could transform into purpose. The reforms implemented in the wake of Officer Mark Reynolds's downfall had begun to take root, though progress was uneven and often frustratingly slow. Transparency measures like mandatory body cam usage were now standard practice, and independent oversight boards had become fixtures in police departments across the country. Community policing initiatives aimed at building trust between officers and residents showed promise, even if skepticism lingered among some groups. Training programs focused on empathy and de-escalation replaced outdated tactics, encouraging officers to think critically about their roles as public servants rather than enforcers. Yet challenges remained. Resistance to change persisted within certain circles of law enforcement, with some officers viewing accountability measures as attacks on their profession. Complaints of misconduct continued to surface, though investigations were now more thorough and consequences more severe. Activists argued that while incremental progress was better than none, true justice required dismantling systemic structures that perpetuated inequality. For Elena, these debates underscored the importance of staying vigilant. Change wasn't linear, it was messy, imperfect, and ongoing. Her advocacy work kept her busy, taking her to conferences, workshops, and community meetings around the nation. She collaborated with grassroots organizations, helping amplify voices often excluded from discussions about reform. Young lawyers sought her guidance, inspired by her ability to balance judicial impartiality with activism. Law schools invited her to speak, eager for students to learn from someone who embodied integrity and determination. Through it all, Elena remained humble, knowing that her efforts were just one piece of a much larger puzzle. One evening, as she sat in her office reviewing case files, Elena received an unexpected email. It was from Sarah Reynolds, the ex-wife of Officer Mark Reynolds. The subject line read simply, "Thank you." Curious, Elena opened the message. "Dear Judge Carter, I hope this note finds you well. I've wanted to reach out for some time, but I never knew where to start. Watching what happened to my husband and seeing the impact it had on our family forced me to confront truths I'd ignored for years. While I don't agree with everything he did, I also know that his actions weren't isolated incidents, they were symptoms of a broken system. Your bravery in speaking out gave me the strength to question things I once accepted without thought. Since the divorce, I've started volunteering with organizations working to reform policing practices. It's my way of trying to make amends for staying silent when I should have spoken up, for enabling behavior I knew was wrong. None of this erases the harm done, but it's a step toward healing. Thank you for being a voice for those who can't speak for themselves. Sincerely, Sarah. Elena stared at the screen, her eyes welling with tears. She hadn't expected gratitude from someone so closely tied to Reynolds, yet here it was, a testament to the ripple effects of standing up for what was right. Sarah's words reminded her that transformation wasn't limited to grand gestures or sweeping policy changes. Sometimes it happened quietly, in moments of reflection and accountability. Meanwhile, Officer Reynolds' life continued its downward spiral. After losing his job, his marriage, and his reputation, he struggled to find stability. His brief stint as a private investigator ended abruptly when clients complained about his abrasive demeanor and lack of professionalism. Financial hardship forced him to sell most of his possessions, leaving him living in a cramped studio apartment. Isolated and embittered, he spent his days watching news channels that catered to conspiracy theories and anti-reform rhetoric. These shows fueled his resentment, convincing him that he was the victim of a vast political agenda designed to destroy law enforcement. But denial couldn't shield him from reality forever. One cold winter morning, as he walked through the city, streets searching for odd jobs, Reynolds passed by a mural dedicated to victims of police brutality. Painted across the wall were portraits of men, women, and children whose lives had been cut short by excessive force. Among them was a quote attributed to Judge Carter: "Justice isn't revenge, it's restoration." The words struck a chord deep within him, stirring emotions he had long suppressed. That night, unable to sleep, Reynolds poured himself a cup of coffee and sat alone in his dimly lit kitchen. Memories flooded back, the faces of people he had wronged, the anger in their eyes, the fear in their voices. He thought about Sarah's decision to leave him, about the colleagues who had distanced themselves, about the protesters chanting slogans outside the police station. Most of all, he thought about Judge Carter, whose calm dignity during their encounter had haunted him ever since. For the first time in years, Reynolds allowed himself to consider the possibility that he might be wrong. What if his actions hadn't been justified? What if he had contributed to the very culture he claimed to despise? The questions weighed heavily on him, forcing him to confront a truth he had spent years denying. Karma wasn't external punishment, it was internal reckoning. The next day, Reynolds made a decision that surprised even himself. He reached out to a local nonprofit organization focused on restorative justice, asking if there was any way he could help. At first, the director hesitated, unsure whether involving someone like Reynolds would undermine their mission. But after meeting with him and hearing his willingness to atone for past mistakes, they agreed to let him participate in workshops aimed at educating former officers about accountability and empathy. It wasn't redemption, not yet, but it was a start. Slowly, Reynolds began rebuilding his life one small step at a time. He attended counseling sessions to address his anger issues, volunteered at food banks to give back to the community, and even wrote letters of apology to individuals he had mistreated during his time as an officer. Some recipients tore up the letters unread. Others acknowledged them with brief notes of acceptance. Each response, whether positive or negative, pushed him closer to understanding the depth of the harm he had caused. Back in her courtroom, Judge Carter presided over cases with the same fairness and compassion that had earned her respect early in her career. Yet something had shifted within her. She carried a newfound sense of hope, a belief that even the hardest hearts could soften given enough time and effort. When she sentenced offenders, she emphasized rehabilitation over retribution, urging them to see their actions as opportunities for growth rather than failure. One afternoon, as she prepared to leave the courthouse, a young boy approached her with a drawing he had made. In bright colors, it depicted a woman wearing a judge's robe, surrounded by smiling figures holding hands. "This is you," the boy said shyly. "My mom says you're making the world better." Elena knelt down to meet his gaze, touched by his innocence. "Thank you," she replied softly. And tell your mom thank you too. We're all doing our part. As she walked home that evening, the city skyline glowing against the twilight sky, Elena felt a profound sense of peace. The road ahead was still long, filled with obstacles and uncertainties. But each step forward brought them closer to a world where fairness wasn't just an ideal, it was a reality. And for Officer Reynolds, whose fall from grace had taught him the weight of consequence, it was a reminder that no one is above the law, not even those sworn to uphold it. In the end, justice wasn't about revenge, it was about restoration. And sometimes, the hardest journeys led to the most meaningful destinations.